A while ago I was diving a century-old shipwreck, and while I was looking at it I started wondering, what is actually the oldest shipwreck that we can still see today? Welcome to another episode of Scuba Science, the entry-level scuba diving show right here on the DiveSAGA channel. I'm fascinated by shipwrecks and I'm fascinated by underwater history in general, and you can clearly see that all over the DiveSAGA channel. But shipwrecks are particularly fascinating because they serve as time capsules that often carry cargo and leave traces of how trade or war was conducted in specific parts of the world. Unfortunately, the ocean is actually a terrible place to store shipwrecks. Wood can be eaten by shipworms and other marine organisms, bacteria break it down, metal corrodes, and wind and waves can absolutely scatter about any remaining pieces that can eventually be covered in sand, making it completely unfindable forever. But the conditions play a huge role in whether a shipwreck can be preserved, and that's why even today there are some remarkably old remains of shipwrecks. There's an important distinction because I'm not necessarily looking at the oldest ship that ever sank. I'm talking about the oldest remains that can still be seen today. So let's dive into them. I'm going to start with one that I actually dove myself and the shipwreck that prompted the question for this specific episode, and that is the SS Polynesien. It sank in 1918, that's 108 years ago, but it's still around today, and what's interesting about it is that it's still pretty much intact. So for being more than 100 years old and still being absolutely recognizable as a ship, I feel like that gives us a pretty good benchmark for our list here. The Polynesien was a French ocean liner that got used during the First World War to transport troops, and it got sunk by a torpedo from a German U-boat. But because the steel hull and the wooden deck is still completely visible, that makes it a very interesting case study. It is a challenging wreck as it lies at 68 meters deep, somewhere off the coast of Malta, and the currents can be brutal, visibility can be bad. We managed to dive it using scooters and trimix, and you can actually find an episode about it right here on the DiveSAGA channel. But there is a slightly older but way more well-known shipwreck that serves as the best possible reference point for this particular episode. The Titanic was on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York when, on April 14, 1912, she famously hit an iceberg and sank. That being said, we cannot scuba dive to the Titanic because it lies at over 3,800 meters deep. That's way further than any human being can scuba dive. But we've been there in submarines and we've sent ROVs down, so we know a lot about the wreck and its condition. It even took 70 years before we found her, because for 70 years nobody knew exactly where she was, and it wasn't until 1985 when a joint American-French expedition actually located the remains. And even since finding the remains until today, there has been a significant change in the structural integrity of this metal ship, and it has actually corroded significantly. Of course, large portions of the ship are still recognizable, and it helps that we have a lot of plans of that era, of that ship, still available to us today to interpret the remains. Nevertheless, we can see it disintegrate right in front of our very eyes. And that's just what happens in 114 years. So what would happen if we go back 270 years? Before we do that, let me give you a quick shout out to the sponsor of this episode, which is the DiveSAGA Masterclass. Last month I launched a complete DiveSAGA underwater filmmaking masterclass. Since a lot of you have questions, and I get questions on an almost daily basis on how to get good results underwater with even the most basic action cameras. So I've created a 9-hour course with 6 modules, 24 segments, It has presentation videos, quizzes, study notes, and I particularly like this, entire DiveSAGA episode breakdowns, including assignments. If you take the mentor package, you can even send in your own work for critique and feedback so that I can help you grow in your underwater filmmaking endeavors. I'll put a link below, go check it out. It's very reasonably priced, especially for the length and quality of the course, because I put a lot of work into it. And the first people who have finished the class say that it has helped them tremendously. So go check it out. In October 1744, the Royal Navy's HMS Victory was returning from the Mediterranean to Great Britain. She was an enormous first-rate warship and the flagship of Admiral Sir John Bolton. But as the fleet entered the English Channel, a storm appeared and scattered all the ships in the fleet, and in the process sinking the HMS Victory. More than 1,000 men were lost at sea, including Admiral Bolton. And for more than 2.5 centuries, nobody knew exactly where the HMS Victory even was. Then in 2008, an exploration company located the wreck somewhere in the English Channel at 80 meters deep. What's interesting about that find is that there isn't actually an enormous wooden ship sitting intact on the seabed. Instead, archaeologists found an archaeological site with, for instance, 41 bronze cannons, fittings from the ship, anchors, iron ballasts, and loose wooden planking. No substantial section of the hull is actually visible underwater. So after almost 300 years, the ship has largely disappeared. But what it was carrying and parts of what it was made of are absolutely still visible. And those components were enough to tell us that this was the HMS Victory. And you'll see that as we go further back in time, that's a recurring theme. Less and less entire ships, but more and more identifiers that allow us to put together the pieces of history. So let's rewind it significantly by about 1700 years. In 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers were hiding from a storm when they decided to dive near the island of Antikythera between Crete and mainland Greece. As they were sheltering for the storm, they decided to dive for sponges. And instead, one of them found something remarkable. At around 40 to 50 meters deep, they encountered the remains of an ancient shipwreck. The wreck appears to have been a large trading or cargo vessel that was cruising the Mediterranean. And what was it carrying? Statues, coins, jewelry, ceramics, and one object that would become one of the most famous archaeological discoveries ever made: the Antikythera mechanism. This was essentially a sophisticated system of bronze gears that was capable of modeling astronomical cycles. But once again, the ship is extremely fragmented. There is no visible hull. There is just a treasure trove of archaeological findings that, when pieced together, we know that this was a shipwreck. But we can go back even further still. In 1985, a diver named Ami Eshel was exploring the shallow waters in Israel off of the kibbutz Magan Michael. As he was doing so, he noticed some unusual stones, pieces of wood, and even pottery. Turned out, he had actually found something pretty special: the remains of an ancient merchant ship. And the cool thing is that even though it was about 70-75 meters from shore, this wreck was sitting at only 2 meters 6 feet deep. That's important because the shallow water may have actually helped preserve the wreck, because a remarkable portion of the hull had survived. The preserved section was roughly 11 meters long and 4 meters wide, and archaeologists were able to use this to reconstruct a vessel that was probably around 13 meters long in total. Inside, they found around 70 pottery vessels, tools, rope, a wooden anchor, and food remains, including figs, grapes, olives, and barley. The wood was in such good condition that there was actually remarkable little evidence of shipworm damage. And that gave archaeologists something incredibly valuable: not just cargo, but an actual ship. This allowed them to study how the planks were constructed, how the hull was assembled, and in general how Mediterranean ships from that era were constructed. So now we're starting to see something remarkable, because that means that over 2,000 years ago, people weren't just throwing simple boats together. They were actually constructing actual merchant ships and crossing the Mediterranean to conduct trade. But we can go even further back, literally into the Bronze Age. Off of the southern coast of Turkey, near the town of Kars, there is a rocky headland called Uluburun. Probably totally butchered how you pronounce that. And sometime around the late 14th century before Christ, a Bronze Age ship sailed past the coast. We don't really know exactly where the ship came from, we don't know where it was going, but we have a pretty good idea of what it was doing, because it was carrying an extraordinary amount of raw materials and luxury goods. The wreck lies on the seabed roughly between 44 and 52 meters, with some of the artifacts scattered as far as 62 meters deep. And between 1984 and 1994, archaeologists spent 10 years digging up this wreck. The ship was carrying 10 tons of copper, shaped distinctly to be recognizable from the Bronze Age. There was also tin, glass, pottery, jewelry, and other objects. In total, more than 17 tons of archaeological material was excavated throughout the project. But this cargo tells us something more important than just about the shipwreck itself. It tells us once again that even during the Bronze Age, the Mediterranean was deeply interconnected. Raw materials and finished goods were moving between different regions and different cultures over enormous distances. But there's one more, and it's 4,000 years old. Off of the Greek island of Dokos, archaeologists found something that at first glance didn't look all that spectacular. Not a giant shipwreck that's sitting upright on the seabed or a wooden hull that you can swim around. Instead, there is an unusual concentration of archaeological material sitting 15 to 20 meters deep. Hundreds of pottery vessels, ceramic objects, and other remains that can only be associated with a ship's cargo. The site was discovered in 1975, and later excavations showed that the pottery belonged to the early Helladic period, which is around 2200 before Christ. The pottery appears to have been commercial merchandise, presumably produced in the Argolid region and then transported around the Aegean. And that tells us something incredibly important, because once again, 4,000 years ago, people were already using ships to conduct international trade. We don't know the name of the ship, we don't know the name of its captain, we don't know where it was going, we have no clue why it sank, and the ship itself is by all means totally gone. Only the cargo remains. But that cargo is more than we need to be able to know that there was once passing a cargo ship through these waters 4 millennia ago. But there's an important caveat here, because when we call Dokos the oldest shipwreck ever found, we're looking at the oldest recognizable underwater shipwreck site. There are in fact older archaeological remains of boats and watercraft that are perhaps preserved on the shores of lakes and swamps, but when it comes to the wreck of Dokos, it is probably the oldest known seafaring wreck that we know of with certainty today. But it is incredibly difficult to date these wrecks and to find any sort of record, because rarely did people write down that this particular ship sank today. So we don't always know exactly which wreck it is, what it was doing, or where it came from, where it was going. But it is almost always enough to help us further complete the picture of international trade and human mobility, especially across the Mediterranean, where the largest concentration of extremely old shipwrecks seems to be. And that's what I love about shipwrecks, because just like when I'm diving the SS Polynesien, I'm not just looking at old pieces of metal, we're looking at little fragments of our story as humans on Earth, and we can of course interpret those with the help of scuba science. If you're into scuba diving, make sure to also follow the DiveSAGA Dive Debrief podcast. You can find it on Spotify and YouTube. In this podcast, we cover the behind the scenes of our DiveSAGA episodes.